redrafting today. And has everyone managed to do a scene to turn up with? Has everyone got a first draft of a scene? Brilliant. So we're going to be working on that scene throughout the session, and the idea is to take you through some processes that kind of replicate a redrafting process that are, I've picked 3 notes that are the 3 notes that I feel like you get versions of most commonly. So we're going to do an exercise that kind of explores each of those notes. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of taking notes and how to be good at taking and responding to notes, and how to know when it's a good note and when it's a bad note, and when you need to push back on it and when you don't. But we'll also talk a little bit about how you can be the person who does that for yourself. So how you can kind of give yourself notes, like when you're, so some things, redrafting is very much a process you'll do with somebody else who's kind of script editing or directing your work, but sometimes you might have to be that person to yourself before you send something kind of off into the world. And I just, so in case it's useful to know, I do theatre still, so I work with Box the Tricks quite a lot, and I'm doing a show with the Octagon at the moment, but I mostly write for telly as my kind of day job. I write on continuing drama quite a lot, and some of the process of getting notes and responding to notes is slightly different between the forms. So if it is interesting, we'll talk a little bit about that as well, and kind of the ways in which theatre notes and telly notes and radio notes are expressed in kind of different ways and how to respond to that, because I think a lot of writers, when you go from writing theatre to writing telly, you kind of look at the amount of notes you're getting and are sort of like, oh my God, they hate me and they think I'm terrible at writing. And actually that is just how they operate, particularly on the continuing dramas. There's just a really different way of kind of working with writers. So we might talk about that a little bit as we go through as well. And there'll be kind of writing pauses where I'll try and say we've got 10 minutes to write now for each exercise. And then I don't know how we'll kind of signal you back if you want to kind of move to a bit of a private space to write rather than be sitting on screen as you write, then feel free to do that and set yourselves a timer. And then I'm going to kind of stick around for a little bit of time at the end of the workshop. So if you've got any more general Q&A type questions, there'll be a space for them later. Does that make sense? Okay, fantastic. All right, so the first, it's so weird doing a workshop and not being able to, like, also I say, does that make sense a lot? So don't always feel like you have to nod along. I'm kind of just partly doing it for myself as I talk. Okay, so the first note that you get a version of a lot, and which is, I think, almost always a useful note, is can we up the ante, or can we raise the stakes? So you get that a lot, I think, of how can we raise the stakes in that scene. And sometimes you'll get it about a drama as a whole, but often in each individual scene, there'll be a need to kind of, how do we make this scene matter? Like, how does this scene earn its keep in your drama? So you should all have a two-hander scene. Is that right? Everyone just got a two-hander. Okay, so two of the ways that you might kind of try and raise the stakes. The first one is by putting a clock on your scene. So how can you make this conversation more urgent for these characters right now? And the first way that I want to explore is by thinking about how you could put a clock on your scene. So in your scene where you've got two characters, give one of them, I'm going to give you two offers for what you can do for this exercise. So the first offer, as a way of rewriting this scene, is to give one of your characters a reason that they urgently need to leave this scene. So why do they need to be somewhere else instead of here. So give one of your characters a reason that they really urgently need to leave the scene. So one of my day jobs is I write on Holby City, and Holby is really useful as a precinct because it's in a hospital. So quite often you play it that the characters need to have a heart-to-heart about their personal life, but one of them is due in surgery right away. So it immediately kind of ups the stakes on that conversation because they've got to do it quickly because one of them's got to go and operate on a brain tumour. So what's the reason why this conversation needs to happen kind of right away? I mean, you do it like, it's like a common gag, but it works. I think that one of the characters kind of really needs the live while the other character is trying to have a heart-to-heart about them. So give your scene a clock. So there's a reason why one of your characters needs this conversation to happen as quickly as possible. So that's the first offer to try as a way of upping the ante in your scene. The second offer is to put a third character into your scene. So how would this dynamic change if actually this conversation wasn't a private conversation between your two characters anymore? So how does that raise the stakes in your scene or kind of increase the pressure on them? And so it could be that it's two characters and one is offering to pay for dinner and the other character doesn't want them to pay for dinner. So how does that scene become different if the waiter is stood right there at the table with the card machine in their hand? So what can you do to kind of raise the pressure? Sometimes adding a third person into the scene can do that. Partly because, again, it speeds up the conversation because people don't normally want to have kind of long conversations in front of a third wheel, but also you can kind of use that as a way to dig into your subtext a little bit more. So what is it that they don't want to say in front of this third person? So those are the two offers for this exercise, to have a go at rewriting your scene, either with a reason that one of your characters urgently needs to get away or with a third person in the scene. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, brilliant. So let's have 10 minutes to rewrite your scene. You might not, depending on, I think the scenes were 2 and 4 minutes, you might not have time to complete the scene, but just have a go at rewriting it with one of those. Does that make sense? 10 minutes, Adam, you're right on the clock. We'll sort of shout you back in 10 minutes, I guess.
Okay, I think that's 10 minutes.
Okay, great. It's like we need like a countdown clock.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's sort of back. I'm not gonna invite people to share their scenes back, partly because obviously we're just sort of drafting, and partly because I just think logistically it might be a little bit tricky to hear each other read in this kind of format. But is there anyone who would like to just share a little bit about how that was as a process or as an exercise? Did anyone kind of find it unlocking anything in their scene or find themselves kind of, I don't know, did it throw up anything interesting for anyone?
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, you go for it, Carl.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say that it was a bit tricky for me because my scene is about two best mates. One of them's a drug addict, and the other one is trying to sober them up and get them off the meth.
Okay,
and
nice.
So they're offering their help in sobering them up. And the friend is like, I've done this before with another friend and I got really nasty and horrible and I don't want you to see me like that. So he's kind of refusing to take the help. And there was already kind of that aspect of one character having a reason to leave, because about halfway through the scene, the character who's the drug addict is like, right, well, I just need to nip out before we start because I need to get some more meth so that we can wean me off gently. And the other one's like, no, you're not going anywhere. So there's that kind of tension sort of there already. So I thought about the clock and putting a clock on the scene, and why is it that we need to get him off the meth now as opposed to 10 weeks from now? So I kind of brought in this idea of like, they're all in this friendship group and a couple of the other friends are getting married in 2 weeks' time, actually 13 days' time, and they're trying to get him sober for the wedding. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so the clock can be kind of a bigger external clock. That's really good, lovely. Anything else it threw up for people? Yeah, Tom, is it? Yeah. Oh, it's very hard on a screen. Maybe put your hand up and then speak quickly, and then hopefully put your hand up, unmute yourself and speak super fast, and that might be the easiest way to do it.
I was just gonna say it sort of made the scene make more sense, you know, like why they would continue having this sort of like, they're just having like a really subtle argument, but it made sense that they wouldn't go out, you know, all out having an argument because someone else is there. It just sort of just clicked into place. It was like, that just makes more sense as a scene now to have someone else there.
Okay, great. Sometimes, every now and again, you'll get a note, and obviously I'm like throwing in quite general things to try out because I've not read any of your scenes, but sometimes you'll get a note and you'll just suddenly be like, oh my gosh, yeah, why didn't I do that? And I think some writers really don't like getting lots of notes, and it's not very good for their process, and some writers do really like to be noted, and sometimes that can also be a hindrance because you can kind of not do the work yourself sometimes because you can think, oh well, they're going to read this and fix this for me anyway. And I think being honest with yourself about what your process is in that line, like I quite like I write really terrible first drafts. My first drafts are always just sort of a mess of like, here are some things that are in my brain that might make a piece of drama, and then I like to kind of give it to someone and be kind of like, okay, so how can we fix this? Some writers really don't like to share work until it's kind of much further along in that process, and I think you have to be quite honest with yourself about which your process is. And also I think some of a good relationship between yourself and whoever you're receiving notes from is just being honest about where you are in that process, and not kind of being afraid to say like, I prefer to receive notes in this way in terms of how you practically like to receive them. So like just really basic things. Some writers like to talk through notes straight away. Some writers like to kind of get your headline notes in an email and then go away and think about it and then have a conversation about it. And I think if it's your first time working with someone, to not be afraid to say, actually, can you just write me some bullet points first and then we can talk? Or to say the other way around, actually, can we have a general chat and then you give me your more detailed notes? Because some people look at a page of notes on an email and be like, oh my gosh, this is loads to change. Whereas if you just talked it through, it would maybe feel less. But some writers prefer to be kind of forearmed before you're having that conversation about it. So I think it kind of is trial and error to get used to what your process is. But I think it's really important to not be afraid to kind of say, actually, it would help me if we could work in this way. And I guess part of that is just being prepared to understand that your first draft, I mean, maybe, but I don't think there's anyone whose first draft is actually brilliant. Do you know what I mean? And I think sometimes when you love your first draft so much and you've kind of poured everything into it, it's really easy to be really defensive at the first set of notes. And I think to treat the second draft as they're like, okay, well, let's try that draft, can be really useful. I think to be prepared to kind of let in someone else's imagination is quite a difficult thing when it's been in your head for a long time, but to actually let whoever's giving your notes kind of imagine onto it. And sometimes it won't work, but sometimes it is that something is missing. So with these, kind of raise the stakes and up the ante. Quite often there'll be a point in your script where whoever's reading it, you lose them, and they might come back with a suggestion of how to fix it that might be kind of putting a clock on it or putting someone else into the scene. Quite often their fix won't actually be the right fix for you. Quite often their suggestion won't actually be the right suggestion to solve it. But the fact that they're suggesting something at that point is what you need to look at, because something either isn't on the page that should be or is on the page that shouldn't be, and it's throwing them off. So whatever, like sometimes when you get your notes, instead of looking what the notes are, start by looking where the notes are coming. So why is there something at this moment that's throwing them out of the story that I want to be telling? Like, what is it that's bumping at this moment? And sometimes I think just a really useful question to ask whoever's giving you notes, that you can ask in a kind of really non-confrontational way, is what's the problem we're trying to fix here? Because quite often a note giver will feel like they can't just tell you something's not working without trying to help you solve it. But sometimes if their solution isn't working for you, rather than trying to do their solution or versions of their solution, the thing you really need to figure out is, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? And once you've got that, then you can kind of work together to solve it. Does that make sense? A really good one, this isn't from something I've written, this is from something that someone told me, was on the show, the BBC did a show called The Three Musketeers that was kind of like a rompy kind of reimagining of the Three Musketeers story, and there was one episode that had a little boy in it, and there was a big fight at the end, and the writer got the note that the little boy should die at the end in order to raise the stakes and kind of really up the ante, but the writer felt that actually for the little boy to die wasn't the kind of right end note for an episode of what was quite a family kind of high energy show. So how he fixed it to get what the note giver wanted of the stakes feeling really high at that moment was earlier in the episode, the little boy was playing with his friends and they were playing kind of sword fighting, and he had on like a breastplate thing, and you sort of forgot that he had it on. He put some other clothes on over it. So in the fight scene, he did get stabbed and it looked like he was dead. But then after the sort of baddies had left, he took off his thing and he was still wearing the breastplate and it had saved his life. So you still got the kind of high stakes that whoever was giving the notes wanted, but you also got what the writer wanted of kind of keeping the feel at the end. So sometimes it's about finding like, well, how can we get what we both want out of this moment, and really drilling down into what that is. Is there anything else people want to say on the exercise that we've just done? Because I've got a kind of another exercise that maybe leads on. Okay, brilliant. So another note, oh yeah, no, go on.
It was really helpful because it made me realise that I've got a habit in other stuff of giving characters like loads of time, and then I get to the end of the scene and I'm like, how do I finish it? So then when I put a clock on it, I was like, oh, it's so simple, but it made a lot of sense. So yeah, it was really helpful.
There's a really useful general note as well that you'll maybe get a lot is like getting late, leave early. And I think that's partly a telly way of writing, partly in theatre you've got to kind of physically move people around in a way that is logical, because you can't just jump in and out of scenes in quite the same way often. But often I think to get in, like to really question, does my scene need to start here? Or could we come in kind of midway through this? And also, does it need to end here, or can we leave this quicker? Can we leave this kind of up in the air still? I think is, again, when you're trying to give yourself notes as you go through, are like really useful. It's really useful to start recognizing what your patterns that you fall into are, so that you can start to try and fix them yourself before you give it to someone else. Okay, so this next exercise is a note that you also get a lot, or I also get a lot. I'm saying all these notes are really common notes. They might just be things that are bad in my writing. So I'm like, everyone always gets this note, but I feel like they're fairly common notes. This note is about digging deeper, that quite often you'll get a note that you're not kind of going deep enough where you want to go, that you're kind of holding something back a little bit. This is a note, this is like an exercise exploring how you can sort of dig a little bit deeper into what you want your scene to be really about. So you're going to choose which version of your scene you like best. So whether the first draft that you originally turned up with or the one you've just written now in this exercise, choose which version of the scene that you're going to redraft again. Does that make sense? So you're either going back to your first draft or you're redrafting your second draft into a third draft, whichever one feels like has got the most promise for you. And I want you to just read that scene to yourself. And I'm going to give you like 2 or 3 minutes to think about what thematically you feel like your scene is about. So is it a scene about friendship? Is it a scene about love? Is it a scene about kind of care in the broader sense? What thematically do you feel like is going on in your scene? Then put your scene to one side and just think about that theme, and just spend 2 or 3 minutes really listing. So let's say your theme is friendship, everything that you associate with friendship, everything physical that you associate with friendship in terms of places, in terms of kind of physical acts. So like playing ping pong, kicking a football about, my best friend's bedroom, any kind of physical locations, and also physical actions, and also maybe any objects that you associate with that theme, and just kind of spend 3 minutes, we'll say, writing all those down, as many as you can possibly think of in 3 minutes. Does that make sense? Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'm going to stop you there, I think, because we could go on brainstorming forever. So has everyone got a list of some things associated with their... Okay, brilliant. So sometimes actually just asking yourself the question, what is this really about, is in itself useful. Like, what is it I'm actually trying to explore? Like, what's the question that I'm asking by writing this? So sometimes it depends how you work. Like, some writers work from character out, or from plot, or from theme. But I think whichever way round you work, at some point you have to ask yourself, okay, but what is this really about? Like, so what's actually the big question that I'm asking in this? And I think it's kind of useful to do that for every scene as well, to think, okay, so what is this scene really about? And then kind of just take a step to explore what that is, what kind of the theme that you're exploring is. So what I'd like you to do now is pick one of those things that's on one of those physical things. So it could be an activity, it could be a physical object, it could have been a location. And what you're going to do is rewrite your scene so that either, so say my friendship things were playing football or cooking apple pie together, you're going to rewrite your scene so that they are either doing one of the things off your list, or they're in one of the locations, or a physical object that you associate with that theme is planted into your scene. And it might be that what you have is actually really quite personal to you, and that in general, not everybody would associate that thing with that thing. That's okay, because actually what will help you to do is connect with those feelings for yourself. So actually it might be that playing football is not very good because it's really universal. So actually, the first play that Adam and I worked on was a play called Streetlights and Shadows, and in it there was a young kind of pair of male-female friends who were kind of in love with each other, but neither of them could say it. And there was a scene in that where they were just sort of eating chips and throwing chips at each other. And that kind of idea of chips being a way that you tell someone you love, so like eating a bag of chips with someone being a way that you tell someone you love them without actually telling them you love them, made its way into that scene. And then actually the whole of Chip Shop Chips kind of became about that, and using kind of Chip Shop Chips as a metaphor for that. So choose a thing that you kind of really connect with that feeling and plant it into your scene. So it could be a place, it could be a physical activity that they're doing, it could be an object, but put something into that scene that really resonates with what the scene is really about, and have a go at rewriting it. Does that make sense? I feel like I've explained that in a really roundabout way, but let's spend let's spend 7 minutes writing. So again, you might not get through the whole of your scene, so 7 minutes to write, okay? But hopefully people kind of got far enough into that exercise to see what it was kind of doing for the scene. Did anyone have any kind of anything it threw up, or any kind of observations from doing that one?
Is that all right if I go first? Yeah, it was really good for me because I was doing a mother-daughter relationship. So I had one daughter coming in looking for her shoes that her mum had like tidied around. I just kind of had the mum like sat there, and it was really weird that I was like, what could she be doing? So I chose like your mum letting you lick the spoon when she's baking. So it added this really nice layer of the daughter was really annoyed at her because her mum was like insisting on wrapping this present while also being nice and giving her the spoon to lick, and then kind of having that thing where they're being really annoyed at each other but also getting along really nicely at the same time. So really, really helped and really like upped the ante of like the annoyance as well.
Lovely, yeah, and I think sometimes adding something physical in can tell you something about their previous relationship without actually telling you it. So that's a really good example of that it can tell you that she's got a lovely memory of doing that with her mum just by doing it. You don't need to kind of then, it's a really good way to show, not tell, kind of your backstory, to have them performing a physical ritual that they've performed before, but the dynamic is different because something in their relationship has shifted. And you can kind of I mean, this is like, it depends how you like to write, but I like to, if you've established something like that as a ritual, find a way to return to it somehow later on to show how the relationship shifted or the dynamic shifted. So sometimes as you're redrafting, it's also useful to look for little moments or little motifs and think, okay, how can I pull that back? Like, how can I get more of this? If we're going to plant this, how can we kind of reuse that later on? So that as you redraft, you're kind of making sure that everything in there is earning its keep and that you're getting the most possible layers out of every scene. And I think by adding in a kind of physical action or object to each of your scenes, you just sort of have your theme really running through then. And it also just makes every scene kind of sing on its own terms. So it's like, oh, this is the potting plant scene, this is the licking the spoon scene, this is the, so give every scene a thing that makes it kind of sing on its own. And I think sometimes when you're in the initial kind of rush of first draft, you just need to say what you need to say and you've not got time to do that yet. But as you redraft, that's when you can kind of start to really add those layers in. And if you haven't got someone giving you notes to force you into that, it can just be really useful, I think, to be like, okay, well, what if they were on a roller coaster during this scene? What if? Just keep asking yourself, well, what if they were somewhere else? What if there was another person here? What if he really needed the toilet? What if, you know, so keep throwing yourself kind of different ways to play the scene and just see how those change it. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that exercise? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, so the sort of initial scene I'd written didn't really sort of have an ending. It was a bit of tension about like a friend having more money than the other one and sort of trying to make grand gestures and that not landing in the way that they just think it's really simple. I'm being nice, I'm buying you stuff, like how nice am I? And then, so doing the list where it's sort of like itemizing those tension points when you've got people with different backgrounds was really useful, because then it meant that I actually sort of was able to find an ending, because it's almost like a second element of conflict on the same lines like appears about how they're going to get home because someone gave someone a lift. But it just like, yeah, it just made it make loads more sense rather than just being like a random kind of conversation. It's like it had a tension point by bringing in, yeah, a secondary point of like someone having more. So that was useful. That's really useful.
Okay, great. Anyone else have anything yet? I'm kind of looking at people, but you're probably not in the same position on my screen as you are.
No. Hi. Might be quite important to bring up. I didn't manage to put any of that in at all. Like, I managed with the first exercise, putting a clock on it, but then this one, I don't know whether it's maybe some notes you just take and some you leave, some aren't helpful. Maybe it's that I'm too afraid to like disrupt the scene. My scene is quite a serious one. It's about one character having Parkinson's and the other finding out and wanting to help her, and the other one being too proud to accept the help. So I found it difficult to think about putting any of the theme things in. Like my theme was friendship, like you said actually, and putting anything in, like it seems like they kind of just need to be having that conversation, maybe without anything else getting in the way. So yeah, maybe that's helpful to other people to know that like it didn't work for me that time.
And that's a really good like general point. Is it, I think you hear a lot writing is rewriting. You hear that said like again and again, but it is also knowing when to stop and when to actually be like, no, actually this doesn't need anything else. And you absolutely definitely will get notes that don't work for you all the time. And sometimes what will happen, and actually I mentioned kind of briefly the difference between TV process and theatre process, is often in theatre you'll kind of be working with a director and it'll be quite a closely collaborative relationship between two people. There might be kind of earlier notes, but by the time something's going to be on, you're usually getting one set of notes from one person, maybe with some outside eye notes from elsewhere. In telly, often you're getting notes from multiple people. So the producer and the exec and your script editor will all have kind of a different version of a set of notes to you. Usually they'll all come to you through the script editor. And usually it's the script editor's job to make sure that you're not getting notes that are kind of pulling against each other. So usually the script editor's already had a conversation with the exec and the producer, and they've had like a lengthy meeting where they've decided which of the notes that will actually filter down to you. But sometimes something will be left in that the two notes aren't achievable together, or they're pulling in different directions. And sometimes it is useful to be like, okay, so where is this note coming from? And again, to return to that, well, what's the problem that we're trying to solve with this note, rather than kind of going for the fix. So absolutely there will be like things that don't kind of work. And sometimes a really useful thing to just ask yourself as you're rewriting is, well, am I making this better, or am I just making it different?
Yeah.
Because quite often when you're redrafting, you're not making it better, you're just making it different. And that's, I think, just practice and like knowing, being honest enough with yourself about when you're resisting a note because it's not very nice to have somebody say that they don't like something that you've written, and when you're resisting a note because actually it's the wrong note. And it can be really difficult to tell the two things apart sometimes. And quite often, like, you'll get a set of notes and at first you'll read them and be like, that's not true, this is it, this works, and you kind of have to go through a slight rage process of like, they don't know what they're talking about, this is nonsense, this isn't going to work, and let yourself have a little sulk about it, and then kind of read the notes again and be like, oh, okay, this is what they mean, and maybe this. And I think it's absolutely fine. I mean, this isn't what you were saying really, but it just makes me think about the process of receiving notes. It's absolutely fine and normal and natural that when you first read a set of notes to be really cross and upset about them, but then you just have to be kind of honest with yourself about which ones really they are actually right, and you do need to let go of that thing that you love or something. I mean, often it's like they'll give you a note, or you'll get a note and you'll be like, that's already there, but actually you might know that that's true, but you've not put it on the page yet. So quite often it's like, and I think when you have the best relationship with someone who gives notes, it's for me, like someone who gives really good notes is someone who tells you what is on the page. So what they're doing is reflecting back what's actually made it onto the page. And you do have to be wary sometimes and know when to spot that what someone's doing is telling you what they would write rather than telling you, because, you know, that's a different thing actually. So if what someone's telling you is just how they would write this, then that's not really useful, because you can't write what they would write. You can only write what you want to write. And the best note givers, I think, reflect back what's actually made it onto the page and kind of ask you questions or make you offers that go deeper into that. And I think the most important question to always ask yourself is this getting me closer to the truth of what I'm trying to say? So every note should be getting you closer to the truth of what you're trying to say. And if the truth of your scene is that it needs to be really pared back and really simple, then it's really good to recognise when the notes are pulling you away from that. And I think that's just practice, is as you hear a note to be like, is this taking me closer to the truth of this or not? And actually, just in terms of working on continuing drama, what's kind of an interesting tension sometimes is sometimes you need to be honest when your truth, like how you see the world, might be different from the truth of the world of the show. And actually it's the job of the note giver to take you closer to the truth of the world of the show. And if you can't write that truth, then that's not the right show for you to be working on. So actually, if you are going into kind of writing on someone else's show or whatever, to really make sure that the truth of that show and the truth of that show's universe is a truth that you kind of can also invest in, if that makes sense, because actually that's your job, is to serve the truth of that show, not kind of what you personally think is the way you see the world. And the same, I guess, actually, when you're finding collaborators in general, the best way is to find people who kind of, you're coming from the same place with the work and try and establish that early on. I want to do one more super quick exercise, but it is past, so I think some people might need to go. So I won't be insulted if people do need to disappear, but I am going to set one more quick exercise, because this is a note that you will get given loads, that I'm sure is not just me. So whichever your favourite version of your scene is, it might be the one you originally came in with, it might be draft 2, or it might be draft 3 that we've just done. So choose whichever your absolute favourite version of your scene is, and I want you to cross out half the words. I want you to halve your word count of your scene. So you have got, let's say, 5 minutes to literally just go through your scene and cross out half the words. So cut your scene in half in 5 minutes. Okay. Let's stop there just because we've already overrun. So especially if you're writing for kind of like TV or radio where it's like to the minute how long your episode's got to be, you will probably always have to cut. But I think it's kind of, and always like, that's one of the ones you get trotted out a lot, is the kill your darlings thing as well, that you have to be prepared sometimes to know when it's time to let go of something, however much you love it, and be like, oh, is this line, is this gag that I spent kind of 2 hours on Google getting just right, is this gag actually still serving my story? So you have to just be prepared sometimes to kind of let go of that stuff. And often you will find that it does make it better as well when you cut. So often there are things that you had to write out onto the page to know it, but actually it doesn't still need to be on the page anymore. So sometimes things are really kind of part of your process to write it down, but that actually you don't need it. So it's helped you get to where you need to be, but you don't necessarily need it in the final cut. And one of the like redrafting thing in general is, if you can at all possible, like especially with cutting, just put it in a drawer somewhere for a little bit of time so that you're not trying to cut it. Like as long as you can give yourself between kind of finishing a draft and then coming back to it, the more you're able to come at it with a kind of critical eye of your own. So the more you're able to read it and be like, oh, actually that thing that I thought really worked, it's okay to let go of that. So give yourself space to kind of finish it, be pleased with it, put it away in a drawer, and then kind of come back to it when it feels a little bit like something kind of with your heart poured all over it. And even actually I like to try and do that, like if I've got a deadline, I try and deadline a couple of days before so that I've got time to do a little bit of a kind of jig myself before I actually send it off out into the world to someone else. Brill. We've already overrun, so sorry. If anyone does have any kind of more general questions or pointers or things to say, then me and Adam are around for a little bit longer, but thank you all very much. That's it, I guess, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Becky. That was great. I'm going to use one of my reactions. Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. Yeah. If anybody does want to stick around, Becky's very kindly offered to kind of field any questions that you've got. I know that we had one question, Becky, regarding the difference between TV and theatre notes that you've kind of touched on and kind of alluded to a couple of times during the workshop. And I just wondered actually if you'd be happy to just kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so in general, you'll find, I mean, not always, obviously, but in general, I think theatre notes tend to come more from a place of asking you questions in order to provoke a response. And so when you first get your first set of telenotes, they are often, especially on a continuing, more prescriptive. So there's often kind of a voice of the show that you have to kind of write to. And so some of the notes aren't necessarily about your writing, they're about kind of how you make this script work for the world of this show. So I think you have to get used to the fact that the notes sometimes are, and there's more like kind of practical considerations, so you have to kind of get used to notes that are more prescriptive than I think a theatre note giver would ever kind of do, which I think can feel a little bit like, can feel a bit bruising to some writers at first, but can also be quite like reassuring of just like, okay, here's a simple thing that I can just do, and so I can just go through my notes and do all the easy ones that are like, oh, this line needs to say this instead. You can kind of get those ones done before coming to the ones that are sort of more big cerebral thinker notes, whereas I think theatre notes tend to be more about challenge you to think about what it is you're really trying to say and kind of asking questions to get you there. And often there's quicker turnarounds in telly on drafts. So just in terms of process, on like a show like Doctors or Holby, which are the telly shows that I write on, the turnaround gets quite fast towards the end, so you're having to turn around drafts quite quickly towards the end. So the big kind of thoughtful notes tend to come earlier. I don't mean that they're careless, the notes that come later, but they're kind of less big questions and more kind of smaller practical kind of, but there can still be quite a lot of them later on, but you just have a short amount of time to turn it round as it goes on, whereas a theatre process I think has more space built into it already. Often you're not kind of having to do as many sort of overnight rewrites in general.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I've got a follow-up question to that actually, from Jess, which is actually about how you kind of adapt your approach to writing for screen instead of theatre. You know, and what yeah, and does it feel like a drastically different process? I guess where's the kind of Venn diagram of similarities and differences?
That's a really good question. I guess it depends what type of theatre you write, and it depends what type of telly you write. So actually, if you've watched I May Destroy You that was on recently, that actually in some ways feels quite theatrical in the way it kind of explores theme and kind of plays with genre. So I don't think there's a hard and fast difference. I think definitely faster process telly, definitely faster, and definitely faster in how the audience receive it as well. So some of the things in theatre, like your audience are there in the room and they're not going anywhere for an hour or 2 hours or however long you decide that they're going to be in that space with you, because to walk out of a theatre is sort of a really big deal. Like, I'm not saying no one ever does it, but in general your audience is there with you for that length of time, whereas when you're writing for screen, your audience could get up any minute and kind of wander off and make a cup of tea or turn over to another channel. So it's faster in terms of how your audience needs to receive information as well often. So you often kind of need to hit the ground running a little bit more. I mean, not always, and there's some really great shows always that kind of don't do those things, but in general, you need to kind of go faster in your storytelling and can go faster in your storytelling, which I think affects your process as well. So you kind of, I find that the way you receive it as an audience member, my process kind of naturally mirrors that anyway, that I write faster for telly than I do for theatre as well.
Great. And is there a difference, Lucy's asking, if there's a difference in terms of upping the ante between TV and theatre? And you kind of touched on it there, but like if you got that note in TV versus how you get it, if you get it for kind of a theatre production, like what would your approach to that be? Is it different?
Yeah, so I think it's partly different in terms of plotting as well. Like TV is more story led, like where theatre you might pitch something for a theatre play that can fill 2 hours of theatre because you'll be riffing around the theme. TV sort of eats story as a medium, so you need more to be happening kind of. But again, there are shows that are really brilliant shows that actually don't do that at all. So I guess none of them are sort of hard and fast rules, but in general, you need more story content for telly than you'd need in theatre. There's less room for kind of riffing around a theme. Like you need more, I don't mean action in terms of things blowing up, but you need more action, physical action to happen, more kind of changes of gear to happen in telly generally. And then like on a show like Holby, it all happens in the hospital precinct. So you need to find cheats and ways to up the ante that aren't kind of, that can still happen with everyone being within the world of a hospital. And so sometimes that's kind of a challenge to come up with a way that, okay, well, how do we up the ante and raise the stakes when this person can't actually physically get out of bed or whatever? So each show will have its own kind of challenges for that as well, I think. But in general, I think it's just kind of, theatre's more exploratory. I think there's more room to kind of pose questions and spend longer exploring them. But again, I mean, it's only because I only finished I May Destroy You last night and I'm a bit obsessed with it. But again, that did a really good job of kind of riffing around a theme for the whole series and finding ways to ask those questions in a way that was still really televisual and really kind of felt like a piece of telly, but in some of what it was doing kind of structurally was maybe more how you'd teach people to write theatre. So some of the rules about the different forms, I think, are kind of being stretched all the time, actually. And theatre, I think, is changing as well in terms of that, like lengths of play is changing and kind of what the theatre experience is for people. So maybe those lines between forms are kind of blurring a bit more.
Great. And Zoe's asking, did you struggle to adapt from writing what you had in your head to writing to fit someone else's brief?
I think I kind of like writing to a brief better in some ways. Like I think I enjoy kind of being like, oh, here's an idea, now write it. I think the bit of sometimes I'm not someone who has like loads of ideas for stories. I think like I like writing dialogue and I like writing character. So actually the way that I write, I think I found it less hard to kind of go into writing. Like I like someone giving me a story and me being like, okay, what's the most interesting, unusual, interesting way to tell this story? And occasionally I'll like land on something that's a story. That's the other thing I think, is knowing when it's a story that you want to hold on to tell your own way, and when it's a story that you're happy. So like on a continuing show, we have conferences where we go and pitch ideas for long running stories. And sometimes you might have something that you know would probably be a good story, but you don't want to pitch it because you want to keep it for you, because you think that's a story that you want to tell your own way. So I think the stories that you know, like this is my story that I really want to tell my own way, you can still keep that for you. Kind of know that actually this is a story that's kind of we can tell together, that belongs in this world of storytelling. It's really like I write a little bit for radio as well, and radio is a really good way to kind of tell your own stories because they're kind of self-contained 42-minute plays. So some of my ideas, I know I'm like, oh, I'll keep this and pitch this as radio because I feel like it suits that. So some of it, once you start writing across the mediums, is knowing which stories will work for which.
Amazing, thank you. I don't think we've got any final questions unless anyone has a burning question to wrap things up. Okay, well, thank you so much, Becky. That's been a brilliant session.
Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, and thank you very much. Lovely to see all your faces today. And yeah, I'll see you again soon. Cheers, guys. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you.